Hello, everyone. My name is John McDonald. Welcome to another fabulous Yes Queen, Thank God, Tongue Pop Death Drop episode of Everything is Gay, Even the Straight Stuff. After doing the research, I felt that was an appropriate introduction. I'm here once again with my fabulous co-host, in line to the secret English throne, just like the spare from Red, White, and Royal Blue. It's Magnus. Hello, Magnus.
Hello, darling. And thank you very much for that introduction. I feel like you've announced me like I'm the belle of the ball, and I'm about to be coronated.
It's true. Well, you are about to be coordinated a little bit. So because we just did my birthday month in April, which was a
Mhm.
celebration of me, as much as every single day is a celebration of me in my mind. I thought we would kick off May, and we're calling this Misunderstood May, and these will be series and movies and things that are sort of misunderstood. Maybe were canceled prematurely. Maybe people just got it completely wrong when they think about these
Mm,
series. And so this first choice was yours. Um,
mm.
in America, we called it Q Force. I don't know if calling it Queer Force was something they called it on Netflix UK, but it's called Q Force here in the States.
You see, I can't quite remember now if that was Q Force or Queer Force on our TV, but as far as I'm aware, everyone addresses it as Queer Force here.
Yeah.
Um, so I wonder whether it was one of those cases of subtle localization at work.
It's not the Streisand effect. It's the thing when you start saying something and then it becomes the well-known fact about it, even if the well-known fact is incorrect. That has a name and is blanking my mind. But we're going to be talking about Q Force or Queer Force, which is
Mm,
kind of the first thing I'd like to talk about is the name of the show.
mm,
Normally, I would start off with kind of who made the show, and I think that's important in this case, so we'll talk about that. But
mm,
even the title of the show is sort of this. The whole premise of the show is based around this title, which is Q Force or Queer Force, and really the title is about the reclaiming of something negative into the positive. And so, do you want to start off
mm.
with that?
Yes, I'm quite happy to do so. I know it's got a bit of, I know that historically, the term queer has had a lot of connotations. I mean, it started off um, in Old English to mean something that was unusual, a bit weird and such, a bit strange. And then it kind of slowly metamorphosized into sort of into a derogatory slang term. I'm not sure how it got to that point, but I believe that that was what people were being had thrown at them back in the day, especially during around the Stonewall riots and such, and a little before then. Am I wrong with that?
I think it's one of those things where we reclaimed it, so we've lost the history of it slightly. But I think
Hmm.
along with the F slur, it's about that it had to do with something that was other, that was seen as useless, or that wasn't like meant for the place it was in. And so it's a whole thing of wherever it came from, because you'll find people that will tell you, well, it was part of what happened in Stonewall, but it wasn't also. So it's an interesting thing about reclaiming terms that became ubiquitous for a group of people, is that
Hmm.
you don't know how much of the accounts of this is where it came from or how it morphed into that you can trust. I know LGBT and queer were both interchangeable for a while we were trying to figure out what the umbrella looked like after the flag was made.
Hmm.
Um, I know some people tried to reclaim it earlier in time before Stonewall and after Stonewall. Some societies like to use it. I can't
Hmm.
remember exactly, but the respectability politics that were kind of at war with inside queer liberation, especially, um, had to do with, did we want to be called queer because it would be normalizing it, or did we want to reclaim the term queer? And so it's very much like you'll find gay folk on all sides of the aisle about the term, and it goes in and
Hmm.
out of fashion. Really, I'm not even I. it might be because we called it queer liberation, we were trying to reclaim the term. It's hard to say.
Mm.
I'm sure the historians watching our show are yelling at me right now because I'm getting it wrong in facts, but unless you were physically there and know the exact date where things were created, some of this stuff is just historically just never going to be resolved. So it just is what it
Mm.
is now as it stands.
Yes. Mm, indeed. Um, so in a sense, the choice of the word as the very first part of the title pretty much puts it right into people's faces and like the forefront of their minds. So you could almost say that the name is sort of like a declaration and also a bit of a challenge in a way to the viewer. Um, I I think there's Queer Eye for the straight guy. But beyond that, do we have many other shows or books that really use the term at the very forefront, or let alone a part of the title?
Well, queer as folk is the big one,
That's
obviously.
oh, yes.
That's
Oh,
the
how could I forget? I
but
really
like
forgot about that for a second.
yeah, but shows like the L word were about it. Like the fact they weren't using it was a big thing for the L word because it was both about love and lesbians.
Mm,
Um, yeah, but queer as a term hasn't been used much. I think it's probably because the Q uh it puts it in the middle of the alphabet, and I think for programming they probably want things unless it's hyper specific like supermarket sweep, they probably want it to be in the first part of the alphabet. I don't know. Um
mm,
we also just haven't lived in a time where we've had a lot of TV that was about the experience of being queer. So there's
mm,
also that. Like we are very used to it now because we've had it for well, we're just comfortable enough in it. But
mm,
it hasn't been that long since we've had shows that starred queer people. I mean, Will and Grace still was young enough that it got its own reboot, which I have feelings about. But yeah,
mm,
there haven't been that many opportunities to it. There's probably some really great like not sketch comedy series, but like YouTube series that would probably take it. Like I don't think
mm.
that the Bad Boy series would necessarily use the word queer, but maybe they would. I don't know.
I wonder if something we should very quickly touch upon is the fact that what we're seeing is also sort of the shift in like perceptions from one generation to the next. And I literally mean from one generation to the next because m- there's everything that we're talking about with queer liberation and such has happened within this last century. It's not it's within the lifetimes of many people that are alive today, the massive shifts that we've seen. And for one generation, it was very much a derogatory slur and such, and they had mixed feelings about its usage. But today's generations that didn't have the generation that have grown up in the last couple of decades, um, whilst we've had protests, whilst we still had the struggle for rights and stuff like that, its usage as a derogatory term has lessened greatly. And so perhaps that's why we're seeing that perceptional shift, um, along with the sense of trying, as you say, to reclaim it and turn it into something. Um, I almost don't want to say positive, but no, depower what the negative connotations were.
Yeah. And I think that that is where we can actually start talking, moving away from the amorphous queer liberation that we're still trying to figure out, which I have some definite thoughts about and how and
Mm,
how we're doing with that currently. But we can actually move into the show because I think this acceptance of the term queer for Q Force and having Sean Hayes as the voice of Steve Merriweather, who's also known as Agent Mary, it's that's sort of the push and pull of did the show do a good job with its message? Was it
mhm.
relevant for the time? Um, why did it only get one season? I have definite thoughts about why it only got one season, most of which is Netflix really loves to be Netflix loved to have its cake and eat it too, so I don't think it was ever gonna get a second season. Um,
Mm,
because that's just how Netflix is really, and this was just one of the many shows that it's done it to. Don't think it had anything to do with the content. I do have some feelings on the content. I can understand why people were ambivalent
mm,
about this show. And
yes.
I think the scene where Steve Merriweather as the leader, as the white cis presenting leader of Q Force is like, I'm gonna reclaim the name queer while we're in West Hollywood. I can see why it's very clever, but I can also see why somebody would see that scene, even in a trailer, and go, oh, either
Mm,
I thought we were past this, or oh, that's not as funny as they think it is. I think it's very clever, but I don't know if it hits
mm,
the mark in terms of humor for me necessarily. There are some very funny moments throughout the series, but
mm,
like as a bellwether for whether the series can succeed or not, that very small scene, I go
mm.
back and forth on whether it worked for me or not.
Indeed. Perhaps this is a good point as we're getting into the show, to touch upon the reason I suggested this particular show today for our conversation.
Yeah, definitely go for it.
Mm. So it touches upon some of the points that you've already raised. So, as this is misunderstood May, the reason I wanted to bring up Q Force as a topic of conversation is I feel it did get a bit of an unfair first impression from the promotional material and the trailers. Um, After we watched the show, I and my partner went back over the trailers and watched them, and it almost feels like the trailers were done in such a way to bring out all the most egregious, corny stereotyping jokes and cram them together in one singular presentation. And the effect was that they it presented a bit of an askewed version of actually what the show was about. Um, yes, it presents quite a bunch of stereotypes, in many of the ways it does. But I feel that the writing at times takes these stereotypes, runs with them, but then starts to twist them back on themselves, and reveals some hidden depths that just does not come across in the freaking trailer. Um, and I understand that perhaps the reason why they wanted to do the trailers is they want to make it look like some sort of big, outrageous comedy. But I can totally see why someone watching that trailer would look at it and just get turned off by it. Just get
Yeah.
see this and think it's just poking fun at age-old stereotypes and would cause a lot of eye rolling. Um, but that is not at all true of what the actual show ended up being. Um, Sorry, small rant over.
No, you're
I shall.
fine. I think for me, I found this show very clever, but I think it was trying too hard to be part of the genre it was part of. A
Mm,
show, so kind of my first major point that I'm going to make, we can talk about a little bit, is that this show was trying to do something between what Archer did and what Venture Brothers did, and both of those were very genre heavy, but moved away from the genre they were in very quickly.
mm,
My kind of first big thing about the ambivalence of this is it tries so hard to stick to its premise of fun parts of James Bond movies. One, you have to really love James Bond movies to stick through it. Two,
yeah.
it succeeds in doing that, but in doing that and then adding in some jokes in places where the tone becomes uneven, the 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 jokes aren't bad. Some of the jokes by themselves I actually chuckled with quite a bit, but in context of the scene, don't always work in the scene themselves. I think
Mm,
if it had I think if it had done like 4 episodes out of the 10 and looked at them and said, "Okay, this really," like it needed to do what Archer did and actually kind of get away, because really the first queer James Bond character is Ray Gillette from Archer. And so
mm,
like you can't ignore that that existence happens, and it just felt like it was too much continuing to try the James Bond lifestyle. I think if it had gotten a second season, it probably would have evened itself out a little bit. But when I think about camp James Bond, I'm more drawn toward what Totally Spies does than
Mm,
necessarily what Q Force did, which isn't
mm,
bad. It's just if you don't like the genre, it's really not going to be for you whether you're queer or not. Like, I don't really watch James Bond
mm,
films. They don't do anything for me. I mean, Daniel Craig shirtless is nice, but they don't really do anything for
mm. Would you argue that the mixture of particular elements then started to mean that it was becoming a becoming appealing to people with specific tastes in what they like? Comedy, spy, action, um, throw in a very heavy gay angle to it all, etc. And on top of that, not necessarily being well polished in places, shall we say?
me. I think for me, the show is almost too clever. When I think about
Mm,
a spy spoof, I think about Melissa McCarthy and Spy. And I
mm,
almost feel like that does more of what I want from because it feels like it's both trying to be much too earnestly a spy thing and also a spy spoof focused on queer underdogs. And I really feel the tension in the episodes of it's trying to get there, but I'm not sure it ever did for me. Now there are some really great moments, great episodes. The cast is really great. The creators are very intelligent. It almost feels like they were too intelligent, like, if they'd taken a step back and either gone full ham into the spy element that just happened to be queer, or go full ham into queer, like, in different I don't know what exactly different direction I need because I don't think it necessarily needed to just something about the spy meeting queer angle that could have worked just didn't gel in a way that I felt
mm,
it's something about it just didn't work. I'm not sure what the tone was, but something about the tone was just off almost the whole
mm,
time for me.
mm.
Yeah.
I can see what you're saying. I wonder whether there was some desire to show LGBT characters in an in a positive action sort of way, because a lot of gay characters often come across as supporting or ineffectual and such. But here you've got a team of diverse individuals that very much like get the job done and have the skills in order to do it.
Yeah.
And I struggled, well, I struggled to think of a mainstream LGBT team that necessarily do that. It's been creeping through in a number of like independent productions and such, but this is definitely one of the most high profile LGBT teams that I can recall.
Yeah, I think there'd be something maybe if it had gone slightly more strange concept, like Codename Kids Next Door went, maybe that would have been slightly more successful or in like
Hmm.
really leaned into the humor of it and gone like Get Smart level. I think for me the issue is in the first episode, and I'm gonna spoil it for everyone. It's been around since uh
It,
2021. So
it's yeah, it's been around for a while. Hopefully this interests people from our conversation to at
yeah.
least give it a bit more credit to check it out. But you know, go ahead, sir.
Well,
Spoil.
yeah. And I want to be fair, and also some of the names in this show are much bigger hitters now than they were when the show came out. So that will also help because do want to give props. There are some major wonderful props to the show that I
Mm,
want to give.
yeah.
But for me, I don't like a starting episode that does a time jump. And there is like a significant time jump in this first episode after Steve Merriweather comes out at his graduation. So the premise is he comes out at his graduation, which keeps him from being the number one spy going off to high post. He ends up in West Hollywood, which is like the least prestigious spy post, and ends up succeeding in spite of himself. Um, but there's like a 10-year time jump before we meet any of the other main characters,
Hmm.
except for David Harbour's Buck character. And it's like So basically, he came out, he got dropped into West Hollywood, and then we see him 10 years later, and he's fully accepted himself. And he's just like full glib and just wink and nod. And like, one of the things that I struggle with in this show is that Steve Merriweather is such a perfect leader. We don't see any of those 10 years of struggle. Like, yes, he is funny. Yes, he's competent. Yes, he has that really great thing on the plane where he admits to liking Sleepless in Seattle. So, he's human. But there's something
Mm,
about a character that struggles that we see absolutely 0% of that struggle. One of the things we love about Dean Winchester is that we saw him struggle on Supernatural. Like, it didn't happen off screen. And I think for me, part of the disconnect is he went from unsure out of the closet right to, yes, Queen, I'm the top spy of West Hollywood. And we didn't see any of that interim. And it feels weird to like go from one to the other without any
mm,
real in between. I think that is kind of jarring. Like, just drop us in. Don't do the prologue. Just drop us in that case if you're not going to show us any of the 10 years of growth. Like, do the
mm,
prologue as the flashback halfway through the series or something. I think that's kind of my thing, is that I didn't see him before
mm,
he was like, you know, perfect mask coated white cisgender gay comfortable with himself. I never saw the
mm,
work he put in to keep his confidence up. So it just all sort of feels unearned in a way. It sort of feels like they didn't do the work of how does he get from one place to the other. And
mm,
I found that very not aggravating, but like kind of distracting the whole time. Because so here's the other thing. This movie, this TV show had the same
mm,
problem for me that Center Stage had, in that their lead character is not the lead character of this show. Um, and I think that's going to be very controversial for people that have seen it or will seen it. But I honestly think that by about the second or third episode, based on the clips I've seen online on YouTube, if you look up Hugh Force, Steve Merriweather is not the head of the show, whereas Archer, for all intents and purposes, always felt like the head of the Archer cartoon. Steve Merriweather kind of is in the way of the plot in some points, I feel like.
mm. I was going to say that, so we'll go back to, um, how the narrative is and the plot progression and such in a minute, because I do have a thought or two regarding that. Um, I will say that we did see some of his flaws in a few of the episodes. Um, so like, let me see. Second episode, he was in such a rush to impress that he nearly um spoiled. He nearly ended up having some important information that was encrypted um deleted because he was trying to force it to get decrypted, and a failsafe kicked in. And then later on, he's so eager now that he's rubbing shoulders with the spying elite at events and such. He's so eager to impress that he nearly messes up um, some of the obligations he's agreed to and such. So we do see a little bit of his personal struggles now that he's actually getting somewhere, so to speak. But in terms of the narrative, I I do wonder if this is a case that they wanted to write a show, um, but the writers might have been aware of the Netflix one season curse. And you did touch upon this earlier with how Netflix approaches shows, wants to have their cake and eat it, so to speak. I wonder if a number of writers are now aware of the fact that there's no guarantee Netflix is going to give them that renewal. So what they decide to do is try and do a self-contained narrative. And we did see it here. By the end of the series, the big bad has been defeated. There's dancing, there's cake, literally. Um, it sort of ties up all the major loose ends whilst leaving enough there to explore in this future season, which sadly didn't happen. Um, but because of that, I wonder if they had to make some choices, and therefore that's why some things like self-development from their past and history didn't really get translated over into the finished product, even though it could have definitely been worthwhile putting in there.
Yeah. Uh, I will also say, because I do want to get to good stuff, but oh, I want to make sure you finish your thought. Sorry about that before
Hmm?
I talk over you.
Oh no, no, no. I finished my
Yeah.
thoughts, sir. The yeah.
I think one thing that is kind of glaring to me that I'm a little bothered by, I actually know how I feel about this,
Mm,
so I'm kind of workshopping it out loud as I speak it.
go ahead.
Episode 3 is called Backache Mountain and takes place in Wyoming. Now that does
Yes.
elicit a chuckle because we know it's in reference to, but it almost feels like it's trying too hard. They have a character following this called Chasten, which is obviously reference to Chasten Bujej. They have instead of Eurovision, they call it the Europe Vision Song Contest. It almost feels like they're trying to stuff a little bit too much of the wink and nod, like, hey, hey, we're queer. Hey, 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 we're gay. Come watch this if you're gay or if you're gay friendly. Like, it feels like if they, it's not bad, but like, I'm wondering if it wouldn't have been so expressly like, look at this episode about what is obviously Brookrock Mountain. If they'd pushed back that pedal just slightly and made organic things that then the characters could shine, I think that might have helped a little bit. Like Twink is a really big presence in the show, well deserved. And I don't fault some of the writers, like Max Silvestri wrote an episode, Guy Branum wrote an episode, who I absolutely adore Guy Branum, which makes me happy. Matt Rogers wrote an episode as well as voicing. I believe he voiced Twink. Yeah, and of course he's pretty big now. I don't know if he was quite as big in 2021. I think he took off shortly after this, but it just feels I- not that it was trying to be, but it was almost trying to be like too much. Like, yes, we're doing this gay, we're doing this gay. There was enough in it without like they have a needless reference to Anne Hathaway as Princess Diaries, Princess of Genovia. uh that's the Stephanie Beatriz voiced character is the Princess of Generovia. Like that's a great nod for gay people that love that, but you didn't necessarily need to like do all of the wings. Like you could have pushed back the pedal on a couple of them, and I think that probably would have allowed the things you naturally had going for you to shine. And that kind of like you kind of have to pick and choose. Like if you stuff it all together, then it's overstuffed. It's like the Taco Town taco, where it's like at some point it's too much. Um, yeah, so I think that's one. I think that's one thing that kind of it just didn't bother me. It distracted me. Is that like there was no reason to have it be like yes, send the characters to Wyoming to put them in a rural setting, but maybe the backache mountain is a little too hat on a hat sort of thing. I don't know. It's also interesting because it's like such overt queerness. I also wonder if I'm just reacting to the overt queerness of it and thinking it's too much. So it's an interesting thing of that push pull I now have as the viewer. It doesn't have like this effortless nature I'd necessarily get. Um, yeah,
Mm. Yes. Um, I still just wonder whether they stuffed it full of so many winks and nods because they weren't sure they were going to get a second season, so they sort of pushed everything in. I do wonder if that is a case then of overstuffing. Um, but it could have been they just thought, you know what, let's just get it all in there.
yeah. And of course,
um,
overstuffing is not something I don't think anybody would complain about, least of all Twink. But it's just something to be aware of is that this show really knows its brand, but it
mm,
almost feels like it knew its brand too much. One thing I love about Schitt's Creek in that it was written with this automatic acceptance of queer people, but like that's not all the show is either by any stretch. It is a very queer show, and of course, Dan
mm,
Levy, who's represented here as a recurring character in Q Force, was also part of Schitt's Creek. But it just feels like yes, that's funny, but why? I guess is the way that I feel.
mm. There's a oh, speaking about Dan Levy's character of Cheslin.
I call him Chasten. You have to do
Ah,
kind of
sorry.
the harshay because it's a Midwest thing, I think. So I don't know if Chasten actually says it like that, but I call him Chasten. So
Yeah, just one minor notice, like interesting that there was a note of like pure horror in Chasten's plot to basically grind down young men into a powder for to keep beautiful and such. That was that was an interesting little um frightening twist on the whole thing. Um,
you know
but
what I
I
like
suppose,
that as a twist though. Like I
mm,
like
yeah.
the examination of vanity in that way. It's very Snow White and it works really well. But if you
Mm,
have too much stuff distracting you from actually examining that, then
mm,
maybe the distractions could be dialed down a bit to let the actual really good plot show through.
mm. So vanity, beauty as an all-consuming desire
Yeah.
that consumes youth, etc. Um,
Which is a really
yeah,
cool note about the gay community, especially in a setting
mm,
like West Hollywood. Because even if it wasn't in West Hollywood for that episode, the conceit of West Hollywood being the domain of a certain type of gay person is it's actually a very good message. But if you dress it up too much, then you lose that message.
wasn't there a whole like a reality Friends show from last year that was all about that very concept? What was it? The
Yeah,
Friends
so it was
or something?
yeah, it's they keep trying to make the Real Housewives of Gay County happen. They keep trying to make a franchise out of it. Like it started with it was before this, but A-List and then A-List New York did it, and of course Reich and Lemocool was on that and Artist and Armor Cost, you know. And so Real Friends of or the Best Friends or the Gay Friends of WeHo, whatever it was, the thing that made all the RuPaul's Drag Race people angry because it preempted like half of the Drag Race episodes for one of the seasons. Yeah, they just keep trying to franchise gay community networks of almost exclusively white cisgender passing gays. They keep trying to make it into like a new Real Housewives thing, but doesn't it just doesn't work for whatever reason.
Mm,
But yeah, that is a thing. I was not surprised because if you piss off RuPaul's Drag Race viewers before your show is aired, they're not going to watch your show. And if that's the audience you want to cross pollinate with, you're kind of dooming yourself from the start.
mm,
But that's
yeah,
neither here nor there, really.
very true. To return to the topic of tonight's conversation,
Yeah.
um, where were we? Where were we? Um, I get the feeling a main message we're getting from this conversation this evening is the fact it felt like there was a lot of potential with the show if it'd been handled differently and if it'd been given the time to fully flourish and such. Um, but sadly, have going with a network like Netflix sadly seemed to very much prevent this from taking
Yeah.
place. I know that there's been some conversation about a Peacock revival, but nothing seems to have come from that, as far as I
Well,
can see.
and Peacock would be the place for it too, because some of the producers and creative forces behind the show are well known to NBC executives. So
Mm,
Sean Hayes, who of course played Jack on Will and Grace, but also Gabe Liedman, um, who was part of the Brooklyn Nine-Nine family, and of course Michael Schur, who created things like The Office, Parks and Rec, who created Brooklyn Nine-Nine, came up with The Good Place. Gabe Liebman also worked on Inside Amy Schumer. Pen 15, which is another darling of Netflix that got canceled too soon, but got more than one season. If you haven't seen Pen 15, it's a really great show about the awkwardness of growing up. But yeah, so like even Todd Milliner, who has kind of this relationship with TV because he was the executive producer of Grimm. So like these are some really big heavyweights of people that know how to make good TV and hit in some very wonderfully startling ways. But sometimes it doesn't work. It's also Netflix isn't really the shining jewel it used to be. Like
Mm,
getting a series at Netflix now isn't the same as like working for Netflix a decade ago as a writer.
mm,
I'm thinking specifically about shows like Wednesday that kind of become a flash in the pan sensation overnight, even if I have some issues with them. But then they just don't get renewed in favor of something like Big Mouth, which is a flash in the pan, but for some reason Netflix decides to nurture it. It seems very capricious, and there's no way to tell why this particular version of the studio system favors things over the other. But
mm,
if you had to pick between Big Mouth and Q Force, I can honestly say Q Force does sound like the better bet. It does sound
mm,
like a safer investment. Big Mouth almost thrives a bit too much on the chaos of the people that created it and going sort of in an oblongs territory, a little bit too Adult Swim. But
mm,
Netflix keeps favoring it for some reason. Um, and I'm not saying that's bad. I know there are a lot of people like Big Mouth, and I think some of it is quite clever. But yeah, for some reason they just didn't want to invest in Q Force, even though a good portion of not just the cast but the producers were really sure bets for things like NBC. I mean,
mm.
Brooklyn Nine-Nine is the dream hit that keeps on giving. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
And LGBT programming has proven itself in recent years to be incredibly, incredibly popular. I mean, Netflix has got Heartstopper of all things, as one of their darlings. The Young Royals had a very dedicated fan base to it as well. On Amazon, there was oh God, Red, White, and Royal Blue. That's it. For some reason, my brain didn't function for a second there. Um, that's got even months on after its release. That's got a really dedicated fan shipping thing. I go on my Twitter and there's constant new alternative universe versions of Alex and Henry. It's not died down at all. So there really is a hunger and a marketplace for good quality LGBT content. It's just for some reason Netflix decided not to do anything with it. Dead End Paranormal Park, which had great LGBT representation, they just unceremoniously dumped it after 2 seasons, and that was a
yeah.
massive, massive shame.
And I was a
Um,
fan of that show because I'm a big fan of Coco Peru, and so it was great to see her doing
mm,
something in a new way and just to have them. But like, this isn't the first queer show that Netflix has dumped. So AJ and the Queen got dumped as well.
ugh,
Um, and
mm,
I can't remember. I know Empire had at least one queer character. I know that was a Fox show, but I think it ended up on Netflix. But yeah, Netflix itself has a desire to both create but then eliminate queerness within it. It's a very strange kind of place where it lives, where it wants its cake and wants to eat it too, sadly.
mm. There was, I forget the name of it, the very popular female wrestlers
Yes.
Netflix
Oh,
show.
Glow. I looked up a whole bunch of shows that Netflix has canceled that were queer or queer adjacent.
Mm,
And Glow really just scratches the surface of
mm,
shows that have been canceled by streaming services, even just in the last couple of years. So shows like Gentleman Jack, which was a really progressive period piece, um, shows like Uncoupled, which was like a Neil
Mm,
Patrick Harris piece, the new Sarah McGill Scheller Wolfpack show, Dead End Parallel
mm,
Park, Batwoman, Fate the Winx saga, which is fine. But there's just this trend of things getting made and then canceled that have this LGBTQ center to them. So whether it's more blatant like this, or it's softer like Fate, the Wing Saga, or if it's about the process of coming out like Love Victor was. For some reason they chose to keep Heartstopper going, but Love Victor didn't seem to work for them. The L Word reboot didn't work for them. Um, it
mm,
just it's unfathomable. The cancellation of Our Flag Means Death, people are still roiled by. And it's kind
mm,
of an unfathomable, like, why are you giving us this hope and these stories and then taking them away? And because we don't really know who sits at the head of Netflix or any of the streaming services in a lot of cases, why?
yeah.
You
We could,
know, why you can't all you can do is ask why? Why? You know?
I mean, sadly, we can make educated guesses, which probably come close to the truth of the matter. Um, and sadly, I think at times it boils down to their weird algorithm decision making regarding viewer numbers versus how much it's being discussed online, popularity, and such, and whether that popularity translates enough to warrant things. Netflix, in particular, is just has a reputation now for being obsessed with the next big hit. Um, it's seen to a degree in other streaming services, but Netflix is just the most blatant of it, I would say. Um, and sadly, they often view LGBT programming as minority programming, stories that don't have that appeal for a wider audience, which is pretty insane to think about when you look at the runaway success of some of the stuff that I mentioned before and how much people have been really into it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and if you're just basically making one chapter, a first season of something, and it doesn't catch fire straight away, of course it's not going to be a success to begin with. Um, we've talked in the past about how some stuff only found its audience after 2, 3 seasons or through repeats. Um, but sadly, it's just not the model that accommodates it. At least not at the moment.
Yeah, and it's not conducive too, because my thought process is also if they gotten a
Mm,
second season or been guaranteed more than one season by Netflix,
mm,
obviously you don't want things to end on a cliffhanger that never gets resolved, but the great show with Michael Urie and Brendan Routh that was about their life as a queer couple, like I think that even got 2 seasons. Or at least
mm,
it got 20 episodes. I feel like a lot of things in this show that needed to be ironed out or they need to get out of their system, they did these in 10 episodes, but then we don't get the next part of the journey. Archer was like on for a decade and its last 2 seasons were incredibly painful. But a part of it is that Archer is this perceived male, masculine, straight lead, even though I'd argue he probably wasn't as straight as people think he was. But it's a very strange thing where like we live in a universe where the queerness of Bob's Burger is absolutely acceptable. And if it was a Netflix show, it would be the beacon of it probably they probably would have picked it over Big Mouth, I think. Um,
mm,
but I don't know what it was like. The humor of so we can take for instance the character of Deb, who is voiced by Wanda Sykes, who's a well-known lesbian actress. She plays a lesbian mechanic. She voices Deb, the lesbian mechanic, who is very skilled. And Deb has some really great one-liners, but she doesn't feel like a character ever being pushed into the background just to be given one-liners, um, which is a thing that does happen sometimes with both lesbian and one-liner female characters. Of course, Wanda Sykes is one of my favorite side characters in Monster in Law, which is the Jennifer Lopez Jane Fonda movie, and I think it's fabulous. Um, but yeah, so it's this interesting balance of they give everybody in this show the spotlight, but I do wonder if they'd given the spotlight to Agent Mary even more than they did, would Netflix
Mm.
have kept the show? Even though I have some umbrage with Agent Mary as probably not as the main character as much as Sean Hayes wanted them to be. I
Mm.
wonder if Agent Mary was quote unquote straight enough to be acceptable, and
Mm.
if it had been less ensemble, if Netflix would have kept it. Because the star of the show is Twink. I'm just going to be
Mm.
honest about that. If the show had been about Twink, I'm pretty sure it would have become an underground classic immediately. Because even though some of the references are a little not out there, but some of the references are going to start in a couple of years to feel just a little dated. Uh,
Mm.
Twink is the master of drag, master of disguise character. Matt Rogers gave some of the best lines to Twink. Um, Twink's kind of vibe with Rick Buck, the David Harbour character, who's kind of the straight agent liaison between the queer people and the straight world that
Mm.
they're working for. Um, they did the really great thing where it wasn't a will they, won't they, but more that Twink is too good for Buck and Buck is too straight for his own good. And I think
Mm.
it's a really interesting way to go with the character. And I think if they had switched, like center stage should have switched characters to the Zoe Saldana character because she was the lead by the time the film ended, but they had to go back to the straight blonde white girl. It's I really do feel like Q4ish if they had panned the camera just to Twink and had Twink been the lead, it would have been a different show for one, but I don't know if Netflix would have saved it, but I think that probably would have saved some of the plot issues that I had.
Mm. You feel that it would have you would have secured more of a well-remembered place within popular memory.
Yeah,
People would have
I
been.
think there's an exuberance to Twink that feels fully realized,
Mm.
whereas Steve feels like Sean Hayes trying to almost play the Will character from Will and Grace instead of the Jack character from Will and Grace. And
Mm.
people really respond well to that flamboyancy. It's part of what makes Are You Being Served something people still remember is because of the
Mm.
flamboyancy of Mrs. Slocum talking about her pussy the whole time, which is really about her cat. And John Inman is the very flamboyant but not out um, male tailor
Mm.
person. But yeah, there's
Well,
something.
yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, I was just gonna mention that there's a reason why, um, Mr. Humphries and Slocum quickly became the stars of the show, and, I mean, originally, the main character was going to be, Mr. Lucas, the young buck that got hired on the first day, but
well, yeah,
he went very much background.
the last 2 seasons, he's not there because he went off to have a successful recording career. I know how successful it was, but that's why they wrote him off the show.
Oh, no, that wasn't the case, from what I remember from, um the books for I read about it after the fact. He got fed up with Humphreys and Slocum being center stage and such, and he just didn't feel there was any room for his character anymore. So he decided to up and leave. And they got that new guy in to replace him, who was basically just a carbon copy with
Yeah,
a bit more of a Cockney accent.
yeah, but it's an interesting thing where, for Q-Force, I firmly believe that if Twink had like
Hmm.
staged a coup, I know Twink didn't want it because there's a really great clip of Twink being like, "I'm too young to have this responsibility," but there was something about Twink embracing their queerness in a way that Steve either wouldn't or couldn't, because Steve did no gender play that I can think of. They didn't even have like a Rocky Horror Picture Show episode where Steve could wear a corset. There's something almost too
Straight
straight
paths,
about
straight passing.
yeah, there's almost something too straight passing about Steve where it still sort of feels like asking for acceptance, where Twink didn't need acceptance and was well past the point of being accepted. Twink was just going to be the having Twink as a master of drag and a master of disguise, like not conflating the two, but having them be complementary. There's something there about Twink that I still works in a show. Um, it's really hard to explain, but I feel like if they had moved the main characterness in season 2
Mm,
potentially to Twink, that it would have been a much more accepted show by queer audiences, and I don't know if it would have saved it. Maybe it still would have been
mm,
lost, but it's one of those things where in a show about queerness, about basically queer James Bond, when your James Bond character is almost too straight to be gay, to it wasn't that he was too straight. It's so hard to explain kind of the because he was openly queer, but he was almost in the way of the show as the head of the team. Maybe the team had too many heads because the deputy director and the director of the International Spy
mm,
Association were both
mm.
prevalent characters in the show. Maybe there were just too many like main characters of this show. You know, I don't know what it was, but I firmly believe that if they'd switched cameras to Twink,
Mm.
that it would have worked better. Maybe it would have.
It,
Maybe
mm,
leading into queerness in that way would have worked for it. I don't know.
they could have phrased it as Twink, mas the mistress of disguises, and like her fun adventures as she's like showing what a superpower, the ability to effortlessly change her very persona at the literal drop of an eyelash can be, and foiling all sorts of dastardly villains and such. Hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe they could. That would have definitely won over a lot of the Drag Race fans, um, to see that in a proper anime form. Mm. I do wonder whether this could very much like they've done this experiment now with doing a spy LGBT show. Whether down the line, perhaps we'll see some other shows in this genre come out, but they'll be a bit more nuanced. So they'll be perhaps a bit more better received.
I think that would work. Reacher is proof that you can make a kind of a spy show with sort of a different vibe because that's really what Reacher is. And I think Alan Richardson does a great job. But Alan Richardson has played a queer straight man before, so he knows how to do it. If you haven't seen Blue Mountain State, where Alan Richardson plays the most masculine, uptight, high strung, almost femme person you'll ever meet. There is a way to do it. I maybe I'm also a little bothered by the fact that Steve Merriweather's agent name was Agent Mary. There's something about that that feels a little too older queer for what they were trying to make. The more that I see
Mm.
it, the more I'm having a bit of a reaction to it that's not necessarily positive. Also, if you go to the Wikipedia page,
Mm.
they drop calling him Agent Mary by like the third episode, and they just start calling him Steve in the synopsis for the episodes, and I have to keep going back and remind myself who Steve is, and I shouldn't have to remind myself who the lead of your show is. Um, Either call him Mary fully and go for it, and have him accept the title the way he accepts Q-Force, or call him Steve.
Mm.
It's a hat on a hat thing again to do that. Like it's just a
Mm.
bit too much.
Mm. I would argue that I think in order to enjoy Q-Force, um, it's best to try and not take it too seriously and have just fun with it.
Yeah,
Um, I'm a great fan of irony. I love wink and nod referential humor, not when it's being a bit too over the top, which it did admittedly sometimes be in Q-Force. But overall, and this comes back to my points again about how the show was initially portrayed within trailers and such. It's not as grating on the nerves as it came across in the promotional material. If you watch it, you will actually be entertained for a good portion of the time with what's going on and the antics of the characters you're seeing on screen. And the fact that they actually managed to put a relatively coherent narrative in the one season without leaving anything feeling too open-ended, like, definitely to be applauded and such. Um, I feel that I can totally see what you're saying, that there's all these little bits and pieces that could, like, why did they choose to do this? Why did they decide on that? Um, but at the same time, perhaps the best way to just watch it is to put yourself in kind of a divorced mindset and just uh, have fun with it, if that makes sense.
yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be the first show that is a show kind of tune into and just have fun. Like, I think about, and this is kind of a weird juxtaposition to make. I think Q Force could have done with a bit of the same breathing room that Scream Queens gave itself. The first season of Scream Queens is probably one of the best sort of depictions of genre that happened in live action in kind of recent memory. And I think part of what worked for Scream Queens would have worked here in that there was a queerness to Scream Queens, but it also gave itself time to breathe in the genre. Like these are just big paragraphs of stuff that they had happen in each episode. Like you kind of have to turn your brain off because otherwise too much is going to happen. Uh like this is an insane amount of words they're using to describe just what happens in one episode. This is easily triple like what you'd
Mm,
see in most blurbs about show episodes. Like this is Buffy season 7 level of stuff going on in an episode, and maybe it just needed breathing room, and that's something.
mm,
It's something we have to become comfortable with. It's something that like I went to see Late Night with the Devil, and it was fine, but it needed 20 more minutes. It stopped too soon. It needed 20 minutes in the middle of it,
mm,
to either ramp it up or to give me space to breathe. It also kind of spoils itself in the first 5 minutes of the film, which kind of had the
oh
same
dear.
problem Q Force had. But it's an interesting thing where if Q Force had let itself breathe a little bit, it probably would have like if they'd given it 12 episodes and they'd done what they did in 10 episodes and 12 episodes and just
Mm,
given itself a moment to breathe, it might have actually worked. I think that maybe the pace actually works against it a little bit. It's hard to say.
mm. It definitely comes across as the sort of show that you could spend quite a bit of time um micro analyzing because of like all these interesting little facets and such.
Yeah.
Um, and I'd argue actually that makes it a great example of something as a student of writing and TV film narrative construction, well worth looking into. Um, if nothing else, and sort of like learn lessons from it and see what it could have been, and then what could be a natural, like spiritual successor to it.
Yeah,
To
and
give us that fully realized show.
it does work. I think the premise of it works especially for people that really like a spy thriller that were
Mm.
annoyed by how much Archer didn't do spy crafting. Like I do think that a little bit of the premise of these are spies doing spy stuff did get in the way slightly. I think that's good because much like procedural TV, like House or something like that, there is a formula that you have to follow, so that can make for really
Mm.
compelling ways to break from that narrative. It doesn't
Mm.
always work, but it works to have the guardrails a little bit.
Mm.
But it again just still feels like it was so much about fun gay James Bond that it missed the portions of James Bond. Like the books about James Bond are so different from the movies because they're bigger. And the books themselves, even though they don't look bigger, the concept of it is bigger because it's about escapism. And James Bond movies don't always get that. But like the spy genre as a whole is escapism. Q Force kind of misses that escapist element of spy. It, like totally spies got the escapist element of and it's one of those things
Mm.
where like I compare it because in a way, except for having an openly queer character on Totally Spies, which one of the triplets could have been, um, Totally Spies was about spycraft, but was also about maturity and kind of found family and learning new skills. It's one of those weird things that you know when you see it, even if you can't put a voice. But if you put Q Force and Totally Spies in the same room, they're very much in the same genre, doing much different work. Q Force is spiritually much closer to Totally Spies than Archer, but it's trying
Yeah.
so hard to be Archer, but it's not that. And I
Mm.
don't know how you pull back from that because you made it such a big part of the premise. It's almost too solid, which is weird to
Mm.
say because normally I'm a big proponent of that, you know?
Indeed. It almost sounds like Q-Force as a thing is what it is.
Yeah.
And if you changed any part of it majorly to sort of to polish it into a better version, it wouldn't be what we know it to be. Um, it would be much better, I think, to take the lessons from it and to craft something brand new that it works in better in ways that would appeal specifically to the audiences that it was aiming for and such. I I do we're getting close to the end of the cat podcast, so I'll try and be quick with this
No!
one
Say
and
it
just
isn't
pull it up.
so. Oh god.
How Twinky. I was gonna say, I wonder if the spy angle on it was an attempt to appeal to the wider audience because it was because it was an LGBT um action-packed show first and foremost. I wonder if this spy setting was a means for them to add some proper like action in that would appeal beyond the LGBT community. Hmm. Or maybe maybe I'm just like making up something out of thin air.
No, and I think that's something to talk about for people that like either watched the show for the first time or watched it and are going back after listening into this episode.
Mm.
But it's an interesting kind of thing if you have to we still live in a world where we have to craft queer stories. I, but Oliver Stark having to defend Evan Buckley is coming out canonically as bisexual in season 7 of 911 is proof that we still have to have these conversations
Mm.
and that people have such like they get stuck on these binaries. And for Oliver Stark, who plays Buck, the point of Buck being bisexual is not whether it's okay for him to be bisexual or not. And it's an interesting thing to watch as how we're trying to craft these stories with subtlety, but it almost feels like there's a portion of viewership that demands things being so black and white that you can't do the subtle work you need to do. And maybe that was something Q Force felt it was having to do and grapple with being the first. I don't think it's bad by any stretch. Um, I think I can easily see Netflix having just given this a second season. There's no reason that they couldn't have. Um, in a way, that probably would have generated more buzz for it, knowing it got a second season. But
Mm,
just like shows like Uncoupled or Batwoman, like it just gets struck down before it has a chance to really find itself. And
mm,
that really does kind of damage having the conversation about how do we craft these characters in this world. Matt Rogers still talks about this fondly. It's still a
mhm,
highlight of his career. His special "Have You Heard of Christmas" is probably one of the funnier Christmas themed specials I've ever seen.
mm,
And it just so happens he does it from a queer perspective, but it's this earnest, hilarious rendition of life. Yeah.
mm,
So there's a lot to talk about in this. Like we didn't even touch on Laurie Metcalf as V, and I do love a good Laurie Metcalf TV show. And we didn't get to talk about Niecy Nash being in this. I do love Niecy Nash, both in Reno 911 and in Scream Queens, in fact. I'd love to do a Niecy Nash body of work sometime, actually. Um, but yeah,
mm,
it's an interesting thing because Q Force wasn't spoofy enough to be a parody like the Naked Gun series, but it was almost too serious in what it was trying to do.
mm,
It's such a weird line, and it's so hard to describe without having someone having seen it that really loves the spy genre. Because
mm,
perhaps as someone that doesn't like the spy genre, I missed something really important to it too. I don't know.
mm. But you know what? By being what it is, this strange mixture of earnestness, yet seriousness, yet willing to take stereotypes and both play them straight, but also turn them back on themselves. It's such an imperfect show that actually comes round to being quite an interesting and almost perfect in being so unique in what it brought across. That I mean, clearly it is because we find it quite interesting to discuss. You know, there's a lot to it, more than quite a few things that, just come and go like that. There's a lot to unpack in this 10 episode one season alone.
Yeah. Did we hit on all the things you wanted to talk about? Did you want to talk about the sentient computer that takes on a female avatar, Jacqueline? Did you want to talk about um, anything else that happened in the show? I want to make sure we talk about the things.
I mean, there is a lot, sir, that we could touch upon. I mean, the whole thing of Jacqueline and Start having their human slash artificial intelligence relationship is by itself a very interesting metaphor for how people interact with relationships and dare I say an online relationship, which this was pretty much what it was. Um, there's a lot to discuss. I don't know. Maybe is there enough, do you think, for another conversation about this? Or do you think we would be just going around a bit in circles?
I think we might be going around in circles. I think it's something where this is where our comment section on either our archives or in whatever Spotify is forcing me now to do with the uploaded episodes, because now it's Spotify podcasts. I don't know, but it's this interesting thing of I'd love to open it up um to kind of the group think. Like, did you see Q Force? Did it look interesting to you? Do you enjoy do you feel queerness was shoehorned into the spy thing? Do you feel the spy thing was shoehorned into a story about queerness? Like how did Q Force sit with you if it sat at all? Um and if we get a lot on our Instagrams or on our archives or on our Spotify or however people get in contact with us, we could look at doing like a actual breakdown of it at some point. I mean, people
Hmm.
have done podcasts about about Stranger Things, so not the show Stranger Things,
Yes.
but just Stranger Things in general for
In
that.
general. Yes, I was going to say which way you were going with that.
No, but like you could do
Yeah,
you could do a breakdown of who's the boss. You could do a who's the boss, thing very easily. But
yeah.
that show, you want to talk about shows that went on for a while. That show got like 8 seasons. Who's the
Mm.
boss was a will they won't they that went on for like 8 years, and it's incredibly insane.
Mm. So do you have any last parting comments, sir, before we wrap up today?
I think queer TV is great, and I think
Mm.
this was a great representation of things that even with the best of intentions in being made, can be misunderstood. And I'm excited to bring my misunderstood May for our next episode, which is probably one of, I wouldn't say my favorite films of all time, but is probably one of the most interestingly contested films of all time. So that'll be very
Ooh,
exciting.
ooh, indeed, you intrigue me now. Um, so my parting thought on this, I encourage people to go and check it out themselves. I get the feeling a lot of people were just like turned off by it or briefly heard about it and then just made a snap judgment on it because of the way it was portrayed. Um, so I really do encourage people to go and give it a watch themselves. If it isn't your cup of tea, completely easy for you to switch the channel or find something else. There's plenty out there to enjoy otherwise. But it could well be that you do find some merit in the show. And, even though it's short-lived, that means that you can go forth and just fully enjoy it in one good or a couple of quick, easy sittings.
No, I love that. We live in spaces where we've niched out the space for us. And so it's super cool that this does exist in all of its positives and negatives together, just for the fact that it exists. And go give it a try. You know, 10 episodes is not enough, but also plenty to get a real feel for where that first season was going. So yeah. And if you enjoy or not, let us know. Um, I know I'm excited that people can discover things along with us,
Mm,
and that sometimes the pop culture really just is gay. Sometimes it's overwhelmingly gay, and that's okay too.
yes,
Um,
indeed.
yeah.
Right. Well, I think it's time to bid everyone farewell for today, and we'll talk to them all soon.
Oh, I hate bidding farewell, but you know what?
Mm.
I love to watch you leave. That's what they say. Thank you
Yes.
everyone for tuning in to Everything's Gay, Even the Straight Stuff. Season 3, if you can believe it, we're still going strong. Woohoo! Zoom couldn't keep us down. Um, we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode as we head into summer. We promise you more hot times. We may be bringing back summer shorts. We have a body of work episode potentially coming up that I'm very excited about. If I can talk Magnus into it. Um, and of
Mm.
course, we're getting to the place where we're going to start thinking about the holidays. It seems like it's not very close, and with climate change, summer may go on forever, but eventually it will be the spooky times. And that's when really all queer power begins to rise. But before we get through that, we have to get through May, and we'll see you next time, come what may. Have a great night,
Yes.
everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.